Hey guys, thanks for joining me for this 40th episode in Season 2 of Good Questions with Cameron Dole. Special guests for this episode include author Michael Heller. We'll be talking about his new book, Mine: How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. We'll also have our monthly visit with Oklahoma State Senator Brent Howard. We'll also visit with author, writing coach, musician, and podcaster Jay Thorn. And our final guest will be Grammy Award-winning producer Dennis Scott. Got a new project, Thank You, Mr. Rogers. If you would, please take the time to subscribe, drop a like, comment, leave some feedback, and of course share with your friends. Now, does anyone else feel like a sack of potatoes in the morning? Well, we come up with a list of things you might be doing in the morning that make you less productive. Like number 1, forcing yourself to wake up too early. Now, don't beat yourself up if you aren't an early bird. You might actually get more done throughout the day if you get more sleep. So if your schedule allows, sleep a little longer and don't feel guilty. Number 2, not getting dressed. Now, believe it or not, staying in sweatpants all day isn't great for productivity. Getting dressed tells your brain something new is about to happen and helps you shift gears. Number 3, skipping breakfast and not drinking water. Being hungry and dehydrated makes it harder to focus, so eat and stay hydrated to be at your best. Number 4, starting the day in reactive mode instead of proactive mode. Being proactive means spending some time thinking about your priorities that day and making a plan. Not reaching your phone first thing could help. And number 5, not prepping the night before. Now, it's hard to do more at the end of a long day, but preparing ahead of time can make a big difference in productivity. And in the long run, it can actually buy you more downtime. When I saw the headline, the name of the title of the book, I knew that we had to talk. Michael Heller, the author of Mine: How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. And first off, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to visit.
I'm so glad to be here with you.
Now, Michael, when did mine, was that one of those words that you had sticking with you your entire life?
It sure was. When I was a little kid, my brothers and I would fight over who got the biggest slice of pie. And I learned from an early age, I have 2 brothers, I can cut anything into perfect thirds and claim mine. And I chose last. So I learned how to cut things perfectly into thirds.
The book, tell us how far mine goes. It goes well beyond our teenage and even young adult stage as well.
Oh, my God, absolutely. So mine is one of the very first words that kids learn. You hear it on the playground all the time. But the same simple stories that kids use on the playground to make something mine, those are the stories that adults use to claim everything in the world. It's just a handful, 6 simple stories, and those stories are how we fight about climate change or about wealth inequality, about who owns your data online. All of those really big fights are the same stories that kids are fighting about on the playground.
And I know one of the things I've seen videos of all over the place, drones, people shooting down the drones because that's my property. And that's just another example of don't take away what's mine. And how far does the line go?
Well, that's a really good question. So you say, my home is my capital. So you go down, you can drill for oil, you can drill for gas or water down. Like what underneath your property is yours and what up above your property is yours. Like 100 years ago, landowners were sending bills to airplane companies saying, hey, you're trespassing above my land. You can't fly above my land. So how far up and how far down it goes, that is all up for grabs. And the current battles today are maybe not at the level of the airplane, but at the level of the drone. Like, is that drone space, the drone way, is it attached to my land? Are you trespassing when you fly your drone over? Or are you free to do so? Is it like a little airplane? And that's something that we just don't know the answer to yet today.
And also, one of my favorites is my personal space. And how do ownership over our personal space affected by those around us as well?
Yeah, so this is like a big deal now with the pandemic. It's like in a lot of places in the country, people are pretty worried about somebody getting too close to them. So you put your blanket down on the beach, and some other family sits down within 6 feet of you. Like, who has to move? And there's no law on this, right? This is one of the, just like with the drone and with personal space, it's really very much up for grabs. How much, what it means to possess something. It's one of our very simple stories of ownership. I have the space. I had it first. Get out of my space. But we all know that feeling, right? But that isn't really, those disputes happen outside the law. They happen just like in our interpersonal, like how we deal with each other around ownership.
Now, are you seeing that people's emotions are getting the best of them over the last 12 months, maybe at a higher rate than we were seeing before?
Absolutely. Like, when people experience it as a life or death matter, then possession, one of the 6 basic stories, something that goes back to our animal territoriality, that animal instinct in us gets aroused in a much more intense way when we feel like, our health is on the line. So, when you see a bird chirping, chirp, 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 you think that sounds so sweet. But what that bird is actually saying is, back off, buddy. This space it's for real. They're saying, back off, this territory is mine. And that same animal instinct actually drives our adult senses of, what's my space.
Now, Michael, how can we make adjustments to where we can maybe live a little bit more peaceably together?
Well, most of the time we do. That's the amazing thing. If we go through our day all day long with hundreds of ownership disputes, when you line up to get your coffee, like that's an ownership conflict over like who gets to go first. And we have a pretty simple, peaceable way of doing it, which is, for the most part, we line up. And that's true to get your driver's license. And it's true for possession. Most of the time, people don't fly drones over your house. It's 1 in a million disputes that ever ends up being a legal dispute. Most of the time, politeness and good manners is what actually solves ownership disputes. And what I tell my students, and they're always like amazed at this, they're law students, what I tell them is law is massively overrated. Like most of the time, people just work it out. And that's the only way we can actually survive as a society, is if we do just, use our politeness and good manners to solve a lot of these problems.
And being able to hear the opposing person's view, whether you agree or not, at least in a respectful mind as well, right?
It isn't easy to do. Like we aren't hardwired for that. So that's a real challenge. It's a challenge for kids, and it's very much a challenge for me as a grown-up.
And on the professor side, how hard is it sometimes to get the feedback from the students that you're so desperately needing?
From the students? My students are not shy. They tell me I'm wrong all the time. Maybe too often. But I'm happy for that. Like, that's part of what's fun about, talking with people and having conversations. It's like, I'm happy to be wrong. That's how I learn and grow, is by people telling me, that's not how it really works. I actually had this conversation with my students this morning about a new phenomena online about having to do with blockchains, like Bitcoin stuff. And I was like, I said something, and they said, actually, no, Professor, you're wrong. All right, I'm happy to be wrong. Tell me how it really works.
That's good stuff. Now, the book again, mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. It is available now. And Michael, I want to be able to give our listeners a little bit of information where they can find more information about the book, and also everything you've got going social media wise as well.
Well, we're on all social media. The hub for the book is our website, which is mindthebook.com. Mindthebook.com. And you can go there. It has all the places you can buy it. The book's available on Amazon, at your local bookstore. It's available everywhere in the country right now. So my preference is that you go to your local bookstore. Keep them alive. But if you can't do that, then go on to any of the online sites. All of them are available from mindthebook.com. We also have great cool videos, and we have a free downloadable ebook. We have a lot of cool material on the site as well that you can just explore even if you don't buy the book.
There you go. Well, Michael, it's been great to visit with you today. I hope you have a great rest of your week as well, and we can catch up again real soon.
I would love to. Thanks so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Now, there aren't many things that can get a bipartisan vote in the Senate in this day and age, but there is one. Both Republicans and Democrats really want to get rid of springing forward and falling back. There's a new bipartisan bill in the Senate to make Sunday's time change the final one ever in the country. Now, it makes a lot of sense to end the time changes. Standard Time might have made sense 100 years ago when it was established to help with train travel, but at this point, the best argument seems to be, well, this is just how we've always done things. Now, daylight savings time has been connected to fewer car accidents, lower risk for heart attacks and strokes, fewer robberies, and less energy usage. So if this becomes a law before November, we'll just stay on daylight savings time for good. No changing back in the fall. Well, our next guest is going to be our good friend, Oklahoma State Senator Brent Howard. We'll share a monthly update of what's going on in Oklahoma City. First off, Brent, appreciate you taking some time to call us in from the office today.
Yeah, appreciate being able to reach out to all of those that are listening there in Altus and surrounding areas.
And Brent, as the new year gets underway, obviously back in session, late nights, early mornings for you. How is the beginning of the new session starting off?
Well, this session just started off right out of the gate. I mean, we were running from the very get-go on this sprint, and it's turned into a marathon. So that's pretty hard whenever you work through a lot, spend a lot of energy right at the first. But we have been the last 2 weeks on chamber deadline week, which means that any bill that originated within the chamber of origin has to be passed out of that chamber of origin. So all Senate bills have to be approved or disapproved by the end of this week, or else they are considered basically dead on arrival and won't be able to be considered further until next session.
What kind of action do they take, whether they even review it or just no review? How does that work, Brent?
Okay, well, it goes through the full legislative process. And what that would be is a senator or a House member has to introduce the legislation. Our deadline on that was back in December, and then we have to put in the language for it, and that's by middle of January. And then through the first 4 weeks of session, we have committee meetings. So the member that introduces the legislation has to take it through the assigned committee. A lot of times, it's pretty straight up and down what committee that is. If you're wanting to change something in the courts, then you're going to go through judiciary. If you're looking at something with schools, you'll go through education. And so we've got 4 weeks to present to those committees. A lot of changes get made in those. That's where we get a lot of feedback to make amendments to our bills, or find out if they're not going to advance forward. If there is a do pass out of committee, which then allows it to get the votes to advance further, then it will come to the floor, at which time the whole body, so either the full Senate or the full House, will then have a vote on it. And that's the deadline, and that's where we're at this point. I think I started out, we had talked, early on at the filing deadline, I had about 35 bills, somewhere in there. Through the committee process, some of them just weren't going to advance. Some of them were already being carried, similar legislation by other members. And so right now at this time, I think that there are 17 that I've already gotten through the Senate floor. So that's fairly common that about half of them just now's not the time. And so we let them go on through.
Now, also, obviously, COVID-19, the pandemic, the vaccination, all have had effects, obviously, on budgeting. And what's the snapshot on the preliminary budget look like?
Well, preliminarily, we're going to be looking at more money that's come in this year. Our Board of Equalization is a constitutional board that sets out how much the state has as far as appropriations and anticipated revenues. Board of Equalization came back with $9.4 billion, which was a huge increase, about a $1.3 billion increase from last year. The main issue with that is, we're looking at 1.1 billion of that is what we would call one-time spending. It's not the recurring tax revenues. It's not sales tax. It's not income tax. It's a breakdown of either delays that came in because, as you recall, last year, we didn't have to file and pay our taxes on April 15th. All of those deadlines got bumped back until July 15th. So some of that money moved over that we collected in July 15th, which was this fiscal year as opposed to the prior. And then a lot of it is just going to be federal funds that have come in. There's no guarantee on that pump continuing, even though they did pass this new, it looks like will pass, I think today or tomorrow, it will be signed by President Biden within the next week, $1.9 trillion in spend, of which the language says that each state will still retain at least what they had through the first COVID relief bill. So whenever you factor in, 130 million or 160 million there, that's where most of those one-time funds come in. So we're trying to be prudent whenever we're looking at that number and not incur recurring expenses with these one-time funds.
What is the biggest issue that your constituents are reaching out to you with so far here in 2021?
A lot of it, there's been probably about 3 or 4 hot topics as we're talking about within the legislation. Outside of legislation, one of the big things that I'm looking at right now, and with my position as chair of the budget committee on public safety, we're getting a lot of people that are not happy with driver's license services, not being able to renew licenses, not 15 and a half, 16-year-olds not being able to get driver's license tests. So that's something that myself, my House counterparts, and also our the chairs of the public safety commissions were working with the commissioner of public safety as well as the governor's office just yesterday on trying to figure out how we can move some of those things around. We've expanded and are going to allow testing to go through career techs. We're expanded the certificate that can be given by private driving schools. So there's some things in place, but I haven't heard from quite as many people within my district, but with the position that I'm in, there are people that are camping out. And I'm not talking about just like 1 or 2 people on a Black Friday. It's almost a daily occurrence at a lot of these bigger city public safety trying to get their driver's licenses. I was sent a photo from a friend that was here in the Moore area, and they got to the office that doesn't open until 8:30 at 7:15, and they were already about 17th person in line.
Wow.
So it's been a big issue that we're hearing a lot about. As far as within the legislation, one of the things we're trying to look at, President Trump had looked at this, was trying to control healthcare costs. And so I think that's probably the biggest issue when we're talking about legislation that we have proposed. There's a Senate bill that would cap prescription costs within this state on the 250 most prescribed drugs. The House, so that one might be considered today. I think it's on the agenda. There's going to be some discussion about it. The House last night passed one that capped prices on insulin. And so that's something, again, that we're hearing from constituents that we're having to choose between rent food or taking the full medication. And so we're trying to get some expansion on that. The other thing that we're talking about is, of course, Medicaid expansion and how that's going to be funded. That really gets into the population that's part of the expansion population, as well as discussions with the healthcare providers, hospitals, doctors are all wanting some input on that, because we're talking about, again, about another $1.1 billion that's going to be spent within the healthcare area. And how does that look?
Now, you talked about the driver's licenses, and when you start talking about automobiles, how is the outlook for the petroleum, the oil industry in Oklahoma this year?
I try to follow that pretty closely, but I can say that within the last 2 weeks, I haven't had time to look at it. I did overhear a conversation. Things are still looking up, at least at this point, as where those prices will go. I don't think that we're going to see those highs that we saw back in 2016, 2015, to where oil got up about that $90 a barrel. But the projections, I think what the Board of Equalization was looking at was around $56. And the last that I had heard was that we were already trading around 60 to 61. So that will bring in some revenue, and we're going to be in an oil producing state and really being a commodity producing a state. We're going to get some benefits from that, which does bring up another point too. We have talked about this, I think, a little bit. My last couple of press releases that have gone out for publication have mentioned that consumers are probably going to see a large spike in their electric and utility bills within the next 1 month. And a lot of that's going to be whenever we had that cold snap come through. A lot of our infrastructure was not ready for, multiple days where we were below zero.
Right.
And so we've been warned. I just want everybody to be aware that they might see a pretty significant spike in those costs. I don't think we're going to see anything like what Texas has. Texas went the full deregulation way. And so there were people that were able to just buy on spot price that were happy whenever they could do that, and they could get their million BTUs on gas for 70 cents. But whenever they were needing the heat and having to pay $1,100 per million BTU. So we don't really have that, but how high that price was drove up the demand whenever we were seeking electricity, because we have a lot of natural gas plants that are our electric producers. So if you've got automatic draft payments on your utility bills, you might want to stop that, or at least be aware. One of the regulations that we put in place with our Secretary of Energy is that there has to be a 2-week notice now prior to anybody that's set up. So you should be seeing those. I think that we probably, like I said, Texas was seeing 400, 500 times what normal rates were for some of these bills. We might see some that are in that 15 to 40 times what you would rather regularly see. We're still working on that. We're trying to work out what a bond or just some coverage so that this can be meted out over a term of 5 to 10 years instead of it all just coming in at once.
Now, Brent, always want to make sure if folks have any questions, you talk about constituents reaching out. What's the best way? I know you're in the office, but probably email still the best?
Email's still the best. I'm spending a lot of time on the Senate floor. Part of my new duties, I'm the chief presiding officer. So anytime there's somebody that's working the gavel that needs a backup, typically I fill in on that. And then I have my day or two, and when I'm not there, I'm presenting bills. But if you'll send me an email or if you'll call the office here, I can typically get a note and try to get back with you. My email is brent.howard@oksenate.gov, and the phone number is 405-521-5612.
All right. Well, Oklahoma State Senator Brent Howard, always great to visit with you, sir. I appreciate you taking some time again there in the office, and look forward to talking to you next month, my friend.
Sounds good. Thank you, Cameron.
Well, you reclaimed 3 full days of your life last year by not sitting in traffic. Instead, you spent them sitting at home. A new report found the average American only spent 26 hours in traffic last year because of all the pandemic shutdowns and remote working. In 2019, we spent 99 hours in traffic. So we reclaimed 73 hours, or just over 3 entire days, and the report says that works out to about $51 billion in time savings. Well, whatever that means. Our next guest on the podcast, he's, man alive, he's got so many slashes behind his name. Author is what I'm going to say, first off, fiction author, horror author, if you will, Jay Thorn with us. And first off, Jay, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure, Cameron. I've been looking forward to this.
And this one we scheduled actually a couple of weeks out, maybe even a month ago. Your schedule a little more packed than mine, but glad we got this worked in. Tell us a little bit where you got into writing. I mean, I went through the bio and I didn't know where to start with you today. So we're going to start with writing first off. Where did that first come to fruition for your life?
Yeah, I have a lot of interest, Cameron, so it complicates matters when people interview me, but I'm usually prepared to go in any number of directions. I was never that person who said all I ever wanted to do was write. I just knew from the minute I was a kid I wanted to be. That was not me. My life would have been so much easier if I had that feeling, but I didn't. But I can trace writing throughout every stage of my life. So my first memories of being a writer is more about being a storyteller. I grew up in the 80s, in the early 80s, and Dungeons and Dragons was a big part of my childhood. And in that game, you have a role of a dungeon master, and the dungeon master's job is to basically create the game for the other players. And I loved being a dungeon master because I could manipulate the story. I could take people on an adventure. And I think that was the genesis of my storytelling. And then, as I grew up, writing and storytelling kind of came in and out of my life. So when I was in college, I wrote op-ed pieces for the school newspaper. For those of you listeners who don't know, a newspaper used to be this piece of paper. They print news on it. And my school, the University of Pittsburgh, had one of those. And I love that. It was a lot of fun. It was my article published once a week, almost like a proto blog of sorts, because it was totally opinion based, and that was a lot of fun. And then into my 30s, I've always been a musician. I've been in a band since I was 18, but in my 30s, I got much more into songwriting, and so the storytelling kind of came out in that part of my life. And then as I was getting into my mid 30s to early 40s, I really started experimenting more with the written word. So starting with short stories, eventually getting to long form fiction and becoming a novelist. And that's kind of where I am now.
Now, how did the songwriting transition into the more literary word for you?
Beautifully. It was, and I think that's a pretty common thing with artists who experiment in different mediums. Being a songwriter, one of the great things about being a songwriter is that you have very limited real estate. Whether it's, even if it's a 9-minute epic song, there's not a lot of real estate for the storytelling. You have to be very succinct. You have to be symbolic. You have to be efficient. And I think that's a skill that sort of transferred over into long form fiction. And I think it was Mark Twain who made the funny comment, who said, I was going to write you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. and that's the idea that it's hard. It's hard to be succinct and direct with language. And so I think for me, being a songwriter first before dabbling in longer form fiction, I kind of carried that skill set over.
Now, who were your inspirations literarily, if you will?
Yeah, it's funny. In 2021, I can cite Stephen King as a literary influence. But when I started reading him in the late 80s, he was a hack, according to mainstream, right? I can remember teachers and other authority figures almost discouraging reading King and Kuntz because it wasn't real literature in their opinion. And now here we are decades later, and that's completely changed. But I was definitely sucked in early on by King and Kuntz primarily. And then like a lot of people who are fans of that genre, it led me back to Poe and Lovecraft and Stoker and Shelley and a lot of the literary greats who wrote more of the darker stuff.
Now, for you, was being a dark writer in the first place, how did you keep yourself from getting just obliviously dark in 2020 in your writing?
Yeah, early on, 10 or 15 years ago when I first started publishing, I was publishing as a straight up horror author. Right. And I would do these podcast interviews and I would finish and the person would say, "Wow, you were so nice." and I was like, I don't know how to take that. I don't know, is that a compliment or and I was like, well, why wouldn't I be? Well, you write horror and it's scary and dark and mean. And I'm like, but it's funny because most of the horror writers, if not all the horror writers I've met in my my time in the industry, have all been the most just wonderfully kind, helpful people. So I think that's a misconception that people have of artists who create art that's darker, whether that's music or film or the written word. And I think I don't know this for sure, but in my experience, the darker themes it's the way I process the world. And I always tell people the real world is way more horrific than any story I could write. And so enabling myself to deal with that and as a coping mechanism, I explore that through story. So it's the common misconception is that people who create scary art are scary people, but I think that's false.
Now, the music transitioning, whenever you're having a writer's block, do you pick up an instrument, play some music? How do you break a writer's block? What is your go-to?
Well, I have a different perspective on writer's block in that I don't really believe it exists. I think it's an excuse for many writers. And I always say, and this isn't a perfect correlation, but I always say, have you ever hired a plumber who had plumber's block? Did you ever call a plumber with a clogged toilet and they said, just not feeling it today. Like, I don't think I can come fix your toilet, right? Like, that doesn't happen. And so it's a bit tongue-in-cheek example, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that people who create art for a living have to approach it like a job. Like, you have to be serious about it. And there's nothing wrong with being a hobbyist and writing or writing music whenever you feel like it or whenever inspiration strikes. And that's totally fine. But if your livelihood depends on it, if you need money to pay your electric bill, you can't afford writer's block. Like, you have to put your butt in the chair and you have to have a routine or a system, whatever it is for you. And you got to show up and you got to do the work, and you got to do the work when you don't feel like it, when you're sick, when you're not sick. It's not a question of waiting for the muse to show up. It's drawing the muse by being where you're supposed to be and doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Now, for somebody that just wants to learn more about writing, just the concept, not to publish or anything, some folks, it's very therapeutic. And I know that you do some author coaching as well. If somebody's just thinking about it, what's the first step? Is it just getting a pen and paper and just sitting down and going for it?
Cameron, it could be, but it's a really writing and I think being an artist is a very individualistic and personal experience. So I always resist the temptation to give people sort of a standard piece of advice. And what I say is, like, you really kind of have to find what works for you. So there's a number of ways you can approach it. Some people would like to sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil and just start and see what happens. Yeah. Other people, they need more guidance, or they need more structure. So they might go to a coach, or they might join a writing group. Other people, and I think I fall into this camp somewhat, other people like to deconstruct a masterwork. So whether that's a song or a novel or a short story, I would find a classic or a favorite, like, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Mm-hmm. I would take that short story and I would read it and I would study it and I would break it down into its parts and say, okay, what did he do here? And how did he structure this part? And then I would make a terrible replica of that, not to publish, but to learn, right? And I would keep trying it. Okay, did I hit that beat right? So I think there's a variety of ways you can approach it. Some people will listen to podcasts and buy books about writing. Some people will take online courses. I think that maybe the unifying thread to that answer would be just to do something active. Take an active role in moving it forward. If you're sitting on the couch watching Netflix and you're thinking, man, I'd really like to be a writer, like, watching Netflix isn't going to get you any closer to that. But if you're at least doing something active in whatever suits you, then you're moving it forward. You're going to gain momentum, and that could be your start.
Now, with all of your varied interests, I mean, what do you do? Is there such a thing as spare time, or are all your interests just your spare time?
I think I've designed my life in a way. So I had a career, a long-time career as an educator. I spent 23 years as a classroom teacher, and I taught kindergartners how to read, and I taught graduate students how to write, and pretty much everything in between. And so when I started to transition into becoming self-employed, one of the greatest pieces of advice I got from my friend Joanna Penn was to diversify your income streams, diversify your revenue. If you are dependent on a single stream of revenue, you are just as vulnerable as someone who is working a salaried job with a boss. I think there's a myth that's somehow safer. But we all know there've been situations where the boss doesn't like you, or the company has to downsize, and you're out. And if that's the only paycheck you have, then what do you do? So I think I've always been very cognizant of that. And as I started to step into I've been self-employed now for going on 5 years. Mm-hmm. And I've tried to set up as many different multiple revenue streams as I can, so that if one drops out, then I'm not scrambling to pay my mortgage, or I'm not scrambling to, put food on the table for my family. So in one way, all of those interests and passions can be monetized. Now, the other side to that is things change when you start doing things and you start monetizing. It changes the nature of it. So you might think, well, I really love to write songs. What if I could make a living at it? Many people do, but it changes the nature of that. Yes. And when you're doing something with that sort of pressure on you, it's different. So it's a word of caution, but I think my general approach is to pursue all those little avenues, those little interests and hobbies. You make $50 here and $10 here and $100 here, And then pretty soon you have all these little streams that feed into a river. And that's, I think, your best. I mean, we've learned over the past year, there's nothing safe. But I think if you diversify in all aspects of your life, you're more cushioned against wide swings in fortune or lack thereof.
And the times we live in, Jay, allow probably a better access for folks to set up alternate streams as well. Yeah,
I think this is the other lesson we've learned over the past year is that this idea of remote work or using the internet to its fullest potential has really revealed that to us. There are many industries, many pursuits that allow you to make money from your laptop. Now, it's not any easier than making money in real life.
No,
I don't want
not.
to give people that impression, but it's more accessible. And so I think if you have a few spare hours or if you have some time on a weekend and you're thinking, I really like my job and it would be nice to start planting these seeds and maybe, this little hobby that I have could turn into a side hustle, or maybe this could start generating income. I mean, there's so many possibilities. I mean, you can look now, think of Airbnb. I mean, that's a great example.
Yeah.
That didn't exist 10 years ago. Right. and so now there's so many more ways to generate revenue and do so online or with a laptop that I think your best bet is to start to dabble. And whether that's on eBay or Airbnb or a client-based service or whatever it happens to be, to start taking those baby steps and just start exploring and learning and teaching yourself how to do that, you're going to be set up for the future.
Now, obviously, I'm going to delve more toward the podcasting side because that's where I'm at personally. For you, how hard was getting comfortable in podcasting? I mean, I thought coming from radio, especially as long as I'd been in radio, it was going to be simple. Not so much, but how about your experience?
It's been mixed. And I think, I've had a similar experience as you have in that I spent decades standing up in front of people talking like that. Mm-hmm. Public speaking was never an issue for me. And then when I started my first podcast, which was in 2014,
wow.
Sitting behind a microphone, talking to myself was really awkward. and the good and the bad thing about podcasting is that episode's still there. Like that first episode of the Horror Writers podcast is out there. And if I listen to it now, I cringe because you just hear the growth, right? And
yes.
and you hear how that's changed. So it's again, it's like the only way to do it, the only way to grow is to do it. So as you get in front of get behind a microphone and you start talking, the best thing you can do is be consistent in your publication schedule. So if it's once a week, whether it's once a month, whatever it happens to be, show up behind the microphone, do it. I guarantee you no one's going to be listening when you start. That's both good and bad. So you can learn, but take some of the pressure off you, but also know that it is out there. And you just do that and you do it every time. One of the things I tell new podcasters, 2 things that you should be doing all the time. You should be listening back to every single thing you put on the air, and listening to what you do. Are you using filler words? Are you speaking too fast, too slow, whatever it happens to be? The second thing is, if you want to be a podcaster, you better be listening to a ton of podcasts, listening to them all the time, different varieties, interview, solo, long form, serialized fictional podcast, whatever it happens to be. You really have to understand the medium to be able to produce in it. And there's no shortcut to that. So it's showing up, it's having a self-analysis in place to listen to what you do, and also being aware of everything else that's happening in that same ecosystem.
And also keep going. You talked about not having listeners, and I remember the first month, and I was like, I'm not going to do it anymore. About 7 months in now, and it's a little bit different ball game. And what was it like for you when you saw the first numbers start to trickle a little bit and then start to exponentially grow? What was the reaction, the first exponential growth you saw?
Yeah, Well, Cameron, I don't want to disappoint you or listeners, but I think my experience is probably more typical in that it took a while. I keep this this estimate. I'm at around 900 episodes over the years that I've recorded or produced, and I think I was into my third podcast before I started to feel that hitting that next level. So it can take time. Some people don't need that time. Some people come out of the gate with either their timing's right, or they got the right concept, or they're hitting the zeitgeist in just the right way, and they see those spikes. I think for me, and I think what's more typical is that you just see these little growths, and then they plateau, and then they start to pick up again. And every time they plateau at a little higher elevation. So I think it's really encouraging. It was encouraging for me to see those numbers. And a lot like writing, if you show up and you keep doing it, you're going to see those numbers continually go up. And like I said, they're not necessarily going to spike unless you have an influencer who shouts you out or whatever. But like, there's some real motivation in that. And you can't see the listener. You don't know who's listening, but you can see those numbers start to grow, and it's like compound interest. The problem, as you probably know, and I don't know if this is true or not. But it's sort of what's been bounced around the podcast space, is that most podcasters quit after 7 episodes, and that's typically because very, very few people are going to see any results after 7 episodes. But people start, they go, "Oh my gosh, you're 7 episodes. No one's listening. Screw this," and they quit. I almost think you might have to give it a year. Like you almost have to give it a full year of producing on a regular schedule before you give yourself the right to quit. And that's hard, but I think that's probably a good rule of thumb.
But yeah, you start seeing the plateaus and the mild growths, the little dips in certain sections. And whenever you see those dips, though, how do you overcome those mentally?
You just get a thick skin. And I think this probably comes from my publishing experience. It's like getting a 1-star review on Amazon for a book that you've published. And like the first time you get it hurts. Maybe the first 100 times, it hurts, because it's like YouTube comments. People they let it fly. Like they don't hold anything back. And you internalize that as a criticism of you instead of your product or your art. And so I think the same is true for podcasting. Like you just kind of have to roll with it. And on one hand, you have to stay the course. And this is going to sound a bit paradoxical, but on one hand, I think you have to stay the course and you have to commit to what you're doing, because if you're constantly changing things, you're not giving people a chance to be grounded or anchored in something. On the other hand, you also have to be willing to make some adjustments, and you have to listen to some things, and that might come through listener feedback. I'm a big proponent of doing surveys, of sending a survey out to your audience and asking specific questions, and looking at that feedback and then making adjustments based on what they say. If 70% of the people are saying, "Wow, your intro is really too long. I wish you would just get to this segment," like that's worth considering. If one person says your logo is stupid and no one else mentions it, then, maybe not. So I think you kind of have to do both of those things at the same time.
That's pretty good. What's the worst feedback, the one that sticks out as the all-time worst feedback you ever had?
Well, there's so much.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that.
I would say, most recently, I'll tell you one most recently that kind of it kind of turned in my gut a little bit. It was I really pride myself on my interview skills. It's something I've worked on for many, many years. And I co-host the Writers Inc. podcast with JD Barker, and we interview a lot of writers, and those writers could be novelists, screenwriters, celebrities who've written a memoir. We kind of cover the whole gamut of writers. And I like to try and to conduct interviews in a slightly unorthodox manner, because I feel like it's something that people don't hear on other podcast formats. And I recently got some feedback that kind of criticized my interviewing skills. And that was kind of hard because it was hard for like I wasn't angry about it, and some of it was justified and some of it I felt like they were way off base, but like I felt like that was a skill set that I had really developed and fine-tuned, and I think it was a reminder to me that you got to have a growth mindset. You always have to be willing to improve. There's always places where you can do a better job, and you kind of have to remember that, and this was a reminder that was forced upon me.
That's funny. Now, do you take more pride in your published works, or say somebody that you've been able to inspire or maybe lead down the road? Do you take an extra sense of pride in maybe their first published work?
Yeah, and I think it's because I've always been a teacher and I'll always be a teacher. And for lack of a better term, I always take more pride in my students' accomplishments than my own. So anytime, I do client work with authors all the time, from book coaching to one-on-one career counseling. And anytime one of my clients or students has a success, I'm way more excited for them. And I don't know why. Like I said, I think maybe that's just hardwired into teachers. I know a lot of teachers who are like that. You really don't know much about them, but you certainly know a lot about their students. And so that's just kind of how I operate.
That's how my brother was, and he was a 25-year music teacher. All the pride in his kids. That's what everybody knew about, was the kids. That's good stuff. Now, Jay, what's on the horizon writing wise for you?
Yeah, writing wise, I'm pretty much staying the course. I mean, these days I publish mostly dark fiction, genre fiction. So, horror, dark fantasy, sci-fi, post-apoc, dystopian. I've been self-published since 2009. I was in the first wave of indie publishers, 12 years ago, 11 years ago now, however long that's been. And so what's on the horizon for me is I'm actively working on a manuscript right now that I'm going to try and pitch to an agent, and hopefully get an agent that will then sell it to a big publishing house. So there are many reasons beyond the scope of this conversation why I've been an independently published author all these years. But now I feel like I'm up to the challenge to kind of play this game, and I want to see if I can do it. So I know I probably won't make as much money having a traditional publisher pick it up as I would doing it myself, but it's not about the money for me at this point. It's more about the challenge. So that's what I'm working on, and I hopefully will have that finished at some point in 2021.
Now, how does goal setting change each year for you, especially since you've gone completely self-employed 5 years ago?
Yeah, I like a lot of things. I have a bit of an untraditional approach to goal setting. I feel goals can be limiting. Like if you set a goal, you almost lose either way. Like let me give you an example. If you say like, okay, my goal is to lose 15 pounds at the end of summer or whatever, right? If you reach that goal, like, you almost lose because maybe you could have lost 25, right? But you'd set on 15. So you kind of lose that way. And then what if you lose 14 and a half? Then you feel like a failure, but are you really a failure for losing 14 and a half pounds instead of 15? So I kind of feel like the assumption of goals is like that they're good. And I think you kind of lose. Now, it might be semantics, and I'm a wordsmith, so take this for what it's worth. Instead of goals, I like to think about aspirations, or I like to think about what kind of experience or lifestyle do I want to have. So instead of saying, I want to publish 10 books, I said, I want to wake up every day and work on something creative for myself that earns me money. So I guess you could say that's a goal, but really it's more about framing the type of life I want to live, and then working backwards from that to design a system or a set of routines that will get me to that point. So the way that looks on a real practical level is, instead of me sitting down and saying, okay, I'm going to write 1,000 words today, I'm going to do that every day. Instead, I say, I'm going to sit my butt in this chair for 2 hours. I'm not going to be on social media. I'm not going to check my email. I'm only going to work on getting these words out. And if I get 100, great. If I get 2,000, great. But if I honor the system and I show up and I do the work every day, eventually I will get to that lifestyle or that aspiration I'm hoping to find.
There you go. Continuous improvement.
Yes. Honoring the system, showing up, doing what you say you're going to do. I kind of feel like in life, if you do that, whether it's, exercise or weight gain or weight loss, I should say, or, writing a book or music or painting, if you if you set up the system and the routine and you honor it, you'll eventually get there without having to set targets to do it.
It'll work in weight gain too.
Yes, it will. That's a good point.
Now, Jay, if folks want to find out more information about all of your work, the coaching, the music, the books, all of that stuff, where's the best place to find everything?
Yeah, I make it simple. I have a website called theauthorlife.com. And if you go there, you can get to all my podcasts and books and resources. And I even have a free self-publishing guide on that people can download. So if you're thinking about publishing a book or it's a someday kind of thing, and you want to know what's involved, you can get that for totally free and kind of get an idea. But that's theauthorlife.com.
All right. Well, Jay, it's been great to visit with you and pick a little bit at your brain, just the author and slight podcasting side. Appreciate you taking some time, and we'll have to make a return appearance here in the near future.
I would enjoy that. Thanks for having me on, Cameron.
Now, they do say when you test drive a car, you should see how it works for the things you like to do day to day. Well, there's a 50-year-old guy named Eric Warren from Wolfforth, Texas, and back in the summer of 2019, he went to a car dealership to test drive a BMW. Well, they let him try it out solo, so he test drove the BMW to a bank and robbed the place. Now, he pulled out something that looked like a gun, demanded $10,000, and then took off. And he headed straight back to the dealership to use his new cash to buy the car. But while he was doing the paperwork, the cops called the dealership to let them know one of their cars was at the scene of a bank robbery that just went down. The staff connected the dots, and they kept Eric there until the cops showed up. He was in court this week and pleaded guilty to bank robbery, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Our next guest on the podcast is Grammy Award-winning music producer Dennis Scott. We'll be talking about the Happy Birthday, Mr. Rogers, which is about a week and a half away. Got a special live streaming event. And first off, Dennis, great to visit.
Where do we begin? Happy birthday, Mr. Rogers. We're about a week away, March 20th. Mr. Rogers would have been 93 years old. But he is just as vital and just as important. And if you talk to a lot of people about Mr. Rogers, they'll say, we need him now more than ever. So I believe that's true.
How did you pull the music to match in with the theme of Mr. Rogers as well?
Well, this really started a number of years ago when I was sitting in my kitchen and they were showing reruns of Mr. Rogers' show, and I happened to catch an episode where he was singing this beautiful little song called It's You I Like. And I wondered, well, who wrote this song? And it turns out, after I did a little research, that Fred Rogers wrote all 200 songs from his show. And it got me thinking, well, who else has sung these songs written by him? And it turns out nobody had. So I thought this is an opportunity and a treasure that I'd like to explore. And we got different artists, celebrity artists, to sing songs written by Fred in their own styles, reimagined and rearranged. And the beauty of it is you see how his songs were not just for children, they were for adult ears as well. And with a little window dressing and production, these songs turn into, really just as suitable radio songs as anything else. Even though the subliminal message is for children, the message is for adults as well. So across the board, Mr. Rogers is for everybody. And I'm very proud of these songs and the album we created, which I know I'm talking a lot, but now you got me excited. So the album I created is called Thank You, Mr. Rogers, Music and Memories. And it's got, people whose names you and hopefully your audience would recognize, like Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees.
Oh, yeah.
My gosh, who I grew up with, and Marilyn McCoo and Billy Davis Jr. from The Fifth Dimension, and then Kelly Pickler and Rita Wilson, who's married to Tom Hanks, who portrayed Mr. Rogers in the movie. So there's a lot going on. And so when his birthday came up, we just thought, we've just got to celebrate.
And now, how much extra pressure do you put on yourself knowing the following and the story of Mr. Rogers to make sure and bring that authentic love across in the music as well?
Well, I didn't have to put pressure on myself. That was put on me by the people who were running Mr. Rogers' company at the time, who were actually a little hesitant, because even though I've proven myself, I think, in the industry, this is still, they are the gatekeepers of all things Mr. Rogers, and they wanted to make sure it was going to be done right. And so it took a year to convince them that I was the guy to work on this, and then another year to actually pull it all together with all these different artists and arrangements. So I'm happy to say that at the end of that, I got a call from Joanne Rogers, Mr. Rogers' wife, and she said to me, Fred would have loved it. And that's all I needed to hear. So I felt that I was on solid ground. And now with this new album, it's kind of like starting over again, because there are all new people who have taken over Mr. Rogers' company after he passed. And so we have to get them on board as well. And so it's, there's a lot of stress involved with it, aside from just the stress of pulling together 11 different artists from different areas in the country and different recording studios, and they all have their own management and different people that have to give the permission to go ahead with it. So I lost a lot of sleep.
Now, how much different was the project this time around? Was the production done pre-pandemic, or was this something done during 2020? We're lucky that we were actually able to do the production before the pandemic hit. So I was flying to Los Angeles to record Tom Bergeron, who, by the way, we should talk about him, because he's a vital part of this project. I bet people don't know that Tom Bergeron is a pretty good singer and a great whistler. Really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that was just one of the great things that happen when you record with people and get to know them. He's just started I forget, we were in the middle of an interview and he started whistling a little bit. And I said, wait a minute, do that again. And I said, that's great. We could use that. And turns out that he sang as well. I said, well, let me hear you sing. So he kind of auditioned over the phone. He was at a burger joint, and I caught him in the middle of bites, and he sang a little bit of a Mr. Rogers song, plus the fact that he was very familiar with Mr. Rogers. He knew his material, so he actually sang a Mr. Rogers song for me with all the correct lyrics. And I said, we got to do this. Wow. We got to take him from his usual association with being a great TV personality and letting him sing.
How hard was it to talk him into that? Was it hard to break through and get him to sing, or was it one of those things that he was like, yeah, let's do this, finally?
No, he was up for it. He really was. I think it's something he doesn't get a lot of requests for, and I'd like to think that because of working on this album and singing on it, he got that little... that big chance to sing on The Masked Singer as a tortilla or whatever he was.
Now, what?
Because they mentioned that he was associated with a trolley car, hence the association with Mr. Rogers when they were giving clues to the panel. So that was fun.
Over the last year as a producer, I mean, how challenging have things gotten, and have you had to get more tech savvy as a result?
Tech savvy, because we're talking right now, and I bought a new camera just for the occasion. So I hope it looks okay.
Looks great.
Oh, okay. Well, you look pretty good too. So.
Well, thank you.
Anyway, here I'm changing the angle so you can actually see one of my Grammys from another children's project. Well, actually, no, that's the one from the Mr. Rogers project. So
oh, wow, that's awesome. Whenever you get nominated for awards, I mean, what is your initial reaction whenever award season comes and goes?
Well, the story I tell about that is that, of course, it's so exciting, and you have almost an out-of-body experience when you're on stage accepting the award. But the reality is, when you get home the next day, I found out you still have to take the trash out. And I said, what's with this? I'm a big deal now. I shouldn't have to do this, but turns out you do have to do it.
It doesn't prescribe those for anybody else.
No, and I tell people that Grammys make great doorstops, if you if you're in need of that. So no, I feel very blessed, very fortunate. I mean, I've had that experience, well, actually 3 times, 2 times as an actual finalist and winner, and then 1 time with I play with and am leader of a Beatles tribute band called the Wanna Beatles.
Wow.
And together we produced a spoken word album interviewing people who are fans of the Beatles who all have these great stories. So that was a nomination for that. In fact, just a little backstory for the new Mr. Rogers album. It didn't start out as a musical album. One, because we didn't have a record company, we didn't have financial backing, and we thought, well, what can we do? We want to do something to celebrate Mr. Rogers. So I took it upon myself to start interviewing people who were fans of his. We went to the local movie house here in Nashville when they were showing the documentary about Mr. Rogers, and I set up an opportunity to have a little Q&A after the movie so people could talk about it. And I immediately found out that people were very anxious to talk about how they felt about Mr. Rogers and just even say thank you to him. So that, I thought, okay, this is good. And we went on that track for a long time, and I thought, well, maybe it would be nice to have maybe one musical artist to go with all these wonderful interviews and shout outs from fans. So Rita Wilson came on board. And when that happened, we thought, well, we have one musical artist, maybe 2 would be good too. And so the list grew and grew, and then people started coming on because they just wanted to. And by the time it was done, we said, all right, well, now we have, was it 11 or 12 different musical artists. Now we don't have room. What do we do with these interviews? There's no room for this. So we thought, okay, we'll put that on the table for now, and an opportunity will come. And hence, the birthday video that we're doing, this virtual birthday party for Mr. Rogers, includes all those interviews that I never got to use before, and people just telling their incredible stories about some of them actually meeting Fred Rogers, and some of them just writing to him and getting wonderful handwritten letters from Fred Rogers. Can you imagine that? He answered all the letters that he received. Who would do that these days?
I have a hard time responding to DMs.
Right.
What is, through all of the interviews and all that, what is the overwhelming takeaway for you as an artist, and then to try to translate that into what others are going to take from your work as well?
Well, of course, I had my own takeaway, which is the first time I did the Mr. Rogers album, it was sort of a musical challenge for me. How do we take these songs that were geared towards children? How do we reimagine them? But this time it was a little different. It was more of an emotional connection because I knew how to do the technical stuff, but now I had a little bit more freedom to explore Mr. Rogers and really look at his lyrics and his songwriting, his craft of songwriting, which I have this whole new respect for him as a songwriter and a musician. And so that was my personal takeaway from that. What was the rest of the question?
How you're hoping to convey that to the listeners as well.
Oh, well, I think Mr. Rogers' songs do speak for themselves, but I hope people appreciate the fact that when you have a song or a songwriter and you find these songs can be done in a multitude of different ways, that's what I would consider somebody who's a likely candidate to be in the Great American Songbook. And in fact, I've taken it upon myself to start a campaign to get Mr. Rogers initiated into the Great American Songbook, because what are the criteria of being a great American song? It's something that people are still listening to and still thinking about and still singing or humming to themselves or whistling, and a song that can be done in a multitude of ways. I mean, if you take a Gershwin song or a Cole Porter song, I mean, you can do it as a bossa nova, you can do it as a swing, and to me, that's the mark of a great song. So I think Mr. Rogers definitely qualifies for that. So I hope people will join us in this little campaign that we're doing. Go to our website, which is thankyouMrRogers.com, and you'll see you can actually vote a petition to get him initiated into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Plus, you can see and hear music from the album and other things as well.
Now, talk about the special event. I know that Tom, well, he got on there, so you let him sing, so he would also take hosting duties. Is that kind of how you worked that out?
Yeah, actually, he was when we were doing the initial push to interview fans, Tom did do interviews, and he asked all sorts of questions about the fans, so he was a natural candidate, and he agreed he still wanted to be part of this as well. And so basically the birthday party is just an offshoot from the album. The album was done and it turned out well, and people are enjoying it and enjoying Mr. Rogers. And, we didn't want this birthday to pass without saying thank you to him for all that he's done. And with the unfortunate passing of his wife, Joanne, just weeks ago, we thought this would be an opportunity to dedicate this particular virtual birthday party to her as well. So that's what we did.
That's awesome. Now, if folks want to find more information, where's the best place to find? Going to be on YouTube and Facebook Live, is that right?
It will be, but the place to actually find us would be on March 20th. Go to thankyouMrRogers.com, and you'll see a link there, and you can tune in and see, and I think there'll be a link for YouTube or Facebook. That's part of the technical stuff you were talking about before.
Yeah, I understand completely.
Yeah, which luckily I have somebody who's younger than I am who knows about this stuff, so he's helping. Hi, Jonathan.
There you go. Well, again, Dennis, thank you for your time today. It's been great to visit with you. The big event, Happy Birthday, Mr. Rogers. It's thankyouMrRogers.com coming up on Saturday, March 20th. And Dennis, I always want to make sure and let folks know the best way to follow social media as well.
Absolutely. We've got a Facebook page. It's Thank You, Mr. Rogers as well. So please come visit me. If you have any questions, I want to be like Mr. Rogers. I will answer any letters I have, even from you.
There you go. Well, Dennis, thank you for your time, sir.
Oh, no, it's been a pleasure. I'd love to come back, and maybe we'll have another project by that time, assuming we all get our shots and everything.
Well, thanks again for joining me for this 40th episode in Season 2 of Good Questions with Cameron Dole. If you ever have a comment, question, or anything else you'd like to know, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, all at GQ with Cam. If you'd like to help out in the funding for this podcast, click on over to the shop at gqwithcam.com/shop. If you have a special guest idea, email me, gqwithcam@gmail.com. Again, thanks to our good friend Brandon Allen for coming up with the theme music. We're going to let him play us out. Hope you guys have a great rest of your Thursday.